Now let's talk about naming conventions. Essentially, your website consists of individual files, basically the pages of your site, that are all linked together. Naming all of these files properly is a pretty important aspect of good web design, and there are some basic rules that you need to follow. Now, some of these rules are a little less crucial than they used to be, and a lot of today's web browsers and servers will let you fudge a little bit. But I still think it's a good idea to do things the right way. It makes things so much easier later on if you need to go back and do things like fix broken links or rename files. First of all, don't use spaces in your files' names, meaning that when you go to save your web page, don't use the space bar if you have multiple words in the file's name, like about space my space company.html. Now, you still see names like this all over the web, and most browsers will actually still be able to bring up pages named in this way. But look what happens when you actually look at the address of the page in your browser. Every time a space appears in the file's name, you see this %20 thing, which is the way of denoting spaces in a browser. Now, in addition to being pretty ugly, imagine trying to tell somebody the address of one of your web pages as, hey, check out my website at mycompany.com/about%20 my%20 company.html. It just would be no fun whatsoever. If you really need to separate words in a file's name, try using either a hyphen or an underscore. You can see here we used an underscore, so about_my_company.html looks a lot nicer in the browser window rather than having those %20 signs in there. You also might want to consider using as short a file name as possible. So instead of about_my_company, we just have about_us.html. The length of the file name doesn't really matter too much when you're linking to the page, but if you have to tell someone the address verbally, you don't want to have to give them too much to type, or you'll increase the chance that they'll make a typo and not be able to find your page. Now, some people like to use capital letters in their file names like this, about the company, all one word, but with a capital A, T, and C in there. And they'll use this as the solution to the space thing. But another rule you should follow is to avoid using capital letters. Again, capital letters are okay in most situations, but some Unix servers are case sensitive, and you'll have to remember how you capitalize things each time you want to bring up a page when you're creating your links, especially if you're doing it manually. So it's much easier to just leave everything lowercase and just use underscores to denote spaces. That way you never have to remember whether you use capital letters or not. Just keep everything lowercase. And you should also avoid using certain characters in your files' names. Underscores and hyphens are okay, but you should avoid using dots, quotes, forward or backward slashes, colons, exclamation points, and question marks, and a whole bunch of other symbols in your files' names. Things like dots are reserved for placing before the file's extension, like .html. And slashes are used to indicate that a file is in a nested directory, so you don't want to use characters like that. Basically, you should avoid using anything other than letters and numbers in your files' names, if you can help it at all. And lastly, let's talk about file name extensions. Basic web page file names end in either .html or .htm. Both are acceptable. .htm was initially used because early DOS servers didn't allow for extensions that were longer than 3 characters. But that's really not an issue these days, so .html is fine. But you should pick one and stick with it. You don't want to have some pages that end with .htm and others that end with .html. It might cause confusion, especially if you have identically named files in a folder like index.htm and index.html. And in Dreamweaver, you can actually set your default preferences under the new document category of Dreamweaver preferences as to whether you want to have .htm or .html be the default extension. And I'll show you where preferences are as soon as we get into Dreamweaver.